How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure, mate. I'm very honoured to have you on. I've really enjoyed your insights on the spring budget, and you were literally the first person I thought of calling to get back on for such a seismic event like this. But before we touch on sort of the big dilemma or maybe opportunity of the evening, could you just sort of refresh everyone's memory, tell everyone a little bit about yourself, and your experience in property?
Absolutely, yes. So my name's Adam Lawrence. I've done around about 1,000 deals in the UK now, including purchases and sales. Held on to most of them, so luckily still holding a little bit over 700 units at the moment. And I'm continuing to build the portfolio. Generally buy through property traders and through auctions as a rule. Some stuff comes direct to me through social media and things like that these days. Work with deal sourcers, brokers, traders, all of those sorts of people in order to try and build the portfolio. So I've been doing it since 2012 in seriousness. But the vast majority of what I've bought has been since 2016 as the business really started to scale. So use a lot of bridging finance, and then hold stuff by getting it out onto term finance as a general rule. Buy cheap, add value, sort problem, get onto term finance. That's kind of it, Chris, really.
Amazing. And in terms of the property industry and sort of your commentary on it regarding the economy, you're the go-to voice really on it with your podcast Proponomics, and I've seen you speak at so many events, and your insights are so valuable. What got you into uh, being a bit of an economist and the economy?
Well, I suppose you have to say that, Chris, because I'm right here, aren't I? So you've got to be nice to me. But in seriousness, I've got a couple of degrees that involved economics quite heavily. So I've always been interested in it. But then as COVID came and the pandemic came, and I was just getting sick of reading really bearish predictions and things that I thought just weren't going to happen. And I thought, where do I go to get some really good information that's unbiased about the UK property market? I don't need to sugarcoat it, and I'm not selling things, I just want the truth. And the reality was I couldn't find it anywhere. So, like all these situations, I then decided, right, I better do it myself then, hadn't I, really? So that's when the supplement was really born in its current form. And it now gets posted once a week on LinkedIn, and a few other websites around the internet. And I try and get on YouTube once a week to talk through it. I don't always find the time to do the YouTube, unfortunately, but I do try. So it really helps me to organize and articulate my thoughts and then get feedback from other people who maybe don't agree with some of the bits that I've said. And it helps me to know the subject matter a lot better, because it's that old, if you read something, you're likely to retain maybe 10% of it. If you read it and write something down, it's more like 30%, blah, blah, blah. If you read something and talk about it and teach it to people, you're likely to retain about 70%. So that's the sort of learning that I'm trying to access by doing what I do in that space, Chris, really.
Fair enough. And I not sort of blowing smoke up your ass in terms of being complimentary,
Well,
because
not in this hot weather. You can't do that, mate. It's too hot for any tomato rice.
that's a problem for me and for you. But the reason that I say that, and why I have such respect for you, because me and you were doing had a conversation, and we'd basically spent all day judging the National Property Awards, and it was a similar temperature to this. The air conditioning was probably a little bit better than the two fans that I've got set up now, but it was a long, sweaty day. And at the end of the day, me and you sat and had about 40 to 45 minutes with each other. And the conversation we had was really about what was happening with the Labour government, what um, what is sort of coming out of the press at the moment. And I speak to a lot of property investors, a lot of landlords, a lot of developers, and they all sort of tend to lean one way, probably because of the business that they're in and in terms of how they are trying to protect the assets that they're building. But you were the first person that I spoke to that actually said, well, there is a lot of stuff that's being churned out in the media right now that is actually very derogatory towards some of the stuff that they are trying to move forward. And it is an absolute shame that they're not better at communicating some of the stuff that they are actually doing. I am paraphrasing, but that's kind of the
No,
sort of gist that I got from my
I
conversation.
remember that does sound like the sort of thing I would have said. Yeah,
And it was so refreshing to hear that, because I think in the world that we live in, with the amount of noise that's coming out of certain publications and certain social media channels, there is no nuance being applied because everyone wants to catch the headlines. Where actually speaking to you, we started to understand the I started to understand the nuance of actually what was happening at that particular time. And it did make me apply a pinch of salt to everything when I was listening to it on the news. So before we get to sort of Keir Starmer's resignation, can you just sort of give your oversight of what you think the last 2 years have been like under a Keir Starmer government, and more in particular, how you feel that Rachel Reeves has performed, because obviously her role is up in the air as well, and it looks more increasingly likely that she's not going to be continuing as Chancellor. But what combined those two in number 10 and number 11, what you would say that the looking back, that sort of 2 years was like for property professionals?
absolutely. Great framing there, Chris. Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think, yeah, Rachel Reeves is probably a 5% chance she might hang on, 95% likely to be gone. I think realistically, Keir Starmer, what will he be remembered for? Not an awful lot, I suppose. We've kind of had a bit of a treacly environment. I think the biggest mistake that they made, which was very obvious from the beginning, was thinking that by sorting out planning, you sort out housing supply. I don't know why they didn't start multiple hairs running at the same time to fix the house building process if that's what they really wanted to do. They reminded me of when we were at school and we did electronics. We used to do these circuits and they would work in series, and if
Yeah,
you flick the switch, the circuit goes out. Whereas really, if they run them in parallel, which is what they should have done, they'd have already addressed viability. Because if they talked to the industry, they'd have known viability was a big problem. If they'd had a sensible forecast over where the interest rates were going, they'd have known the cost of debt would remain to be a problem. If they'd had a sensible attitude to inflation, you get the picture, sort of thing. So they didn't really, and this is part of the problem with how government works these days. They worked on sound bites, they worked on stuff that sounded good. They didn't think about what would actually work. Some of that is ideology that gets in the way. Some of the things they promised to do that just had an air of a bit of spite to them, really, like private school fees. Who has that managed to help? 30,000 kids now not going to private school, 30,000 more kids in the state education system that already can't cope with falling down buildings and all the rest of it. I'm not sure any of that was that clever, because the tax they've made on the VAT is probably netted out by the tax being spent on the extra 30,000 kids to provide for. So as soon as you come away from common sense and good judgment and get towards politics and ideology, politics is like football. People feel like they've got to pick a side, whereas you really got people like me saying, well, what they're going to do, what does it mean, and what difference does it make? We've had to largely keep calm and carry on throughout it all. We've obviously seen the Renters' Rights Act. We knew it was coming. We knew what was coming. We knew the Section 21 was going. There have been a few nuances, a couple of ups and downs. But really, I'm actually surprised. I mean, we're at the end of June now, aren't we? But I thought it would create more opportunities than it has already, to be honest with you, Chris. I thought we might see a few more properties for sale. The biggest opportunity they created was nearly straight away. And there's a classic lesson here for everyone. The traders say, buy the rumour, sell the fact, right? When Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer came out in early September to talk about the budget that was coming in 2024 at the end of October, I just saw the way they presented the whole thing, and they were so miserable and so bearish. I thought this is going to trigger a big sell-off here, because we've had this big change, different government after 14 years, and now people are going to think she's going to jack capital gains tax up. And I knew they weren't going to. I knew they weren't going to with near certainty, because ultimately, if you ask HMRC, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the Treasury, everyone remotely important, they will tell you if you put CGT up to income tax levels, you will take less CGT. And what we need at the moment is money, because we've been overspending And we've been under collecting, although we've got the highest tax burden we've had since World War II. So that window of opportunity, that 2 months, was the most incredible 2 months of my property career by a long chalk. We bought over 100 properties in that 2 month period. And then the shock, the only shock really in that budget, was making the stamp duty 5% additional stamp. So again, you could look at that as a real negative, but really that created opportunity, right? That created a lot of opportunity. So we were still buying units like we always do when there's a surprise stamp hike. We were buying units 5, 6, 7% cheaper than we would have done. We had to pay an extra 2%, sure, but we're still quids in those situations, Chris. So that was a great result for us, really. That purple patch went from about September the 4th or 5th, I think it was, when they started talking about it, all the way through. Died off a bit in 2025, early 2025, but by then we had so much work in progress in the pipeline, we had to take a bit of a pause, or at least slow down significantly on buying anyway. And I like being in those spots because apart from anything else, you get very, very picky with what you'll buy, and you get very punchy with the prices you offer. So you might buy one or two where you would have bought 10 or 20, but the one or two you buy are really stonking deals. So we had a bit of operational flex and stuff to work through. So that covered a lot of 2025. We had a huge amount of work to do on the back of that front. Of course, then we knew renters' rights was looming. As I said, I thought that things were going to get a bit more interesting than they did, to be honest with you. We haven't seen much fallout of that yet, to be honest. In fact, I published an article the other day, which was about the fact that until the year ending March 2025, the last full fiscal year before the one we've just completed, ultimately we saw 54,000 more rental units in the private rental sector. So that's where we were. I think most people can't really believe that, to be honest, but this is the difference between what you see and what you hear and what really goes on. So in terms of what you saw and heard, landlords are saying they were selling up. A lot of the corporates, whether they be quite small or growing or quite large, don't really shout about what they're doing. I'm quite unusual on that front in that I do write, talk, blog about it, all the rest of it. But the number of units was going up, not down. 54,000 additional units in 2024-25. So that is, with most of that fiscal year was under a Labour government. Most of that knew that renters' rights was coming, etc., etc., etc. So we were still adding units to the supply of rental units. And in fact, tenant demand, the demand supply imbalance in rental is as low as it's been for about 6 years, but it's still drastically more difficult than it was before COVID to rent a property. So I think the legacy, and certainly the legacy that I will take away from Starmer and Reeves, is that they said the right things. And you could say, look, politicians always say the right things, but they really did say the right things. Growth, 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 right? We're going to cut regulation. Really positive. We all know that's the way that the economy grows, right? And then they didn't do it. They cut a bit of regulation. Rachel Reeves encouraged the regulator, well, where the regulatory statement always was, encouraged the banks to look at how much they could safely lend first-time buyers. The result of that was the average first-time buyer could borrow an extra 25 grand on average on the same income, right? So really extended some credit. That started to filter through. Things were going well. And then ultimately, they had an oven-baked excuse, but it was too late by then anyway. Israel and the USA getting involved in Iran in a hot war obviously spiked the price of oil. Things are on the way back down again now. For the moment, don't know if the volatility's over, whether the Trump family have traded enough for profits, losses and gains and whatever else out of all of that. But they said the right things. They just did not deliver them. And then, as you said earlier on that we'd been talking about, the good bits they did do, they haven't shouted about or communicated about at all. It's almost like they're embarrassed of some of this. They brought net migration down, which is they're so confused about what to do with that information because they don't want to sound like reform and they don't want to annoy their voter base, some of which their voter base thinks immigration is a good thing and there should be as much as possible. So it puts them in a tough position because they knew that needed to happen. They also know in their heart of hearts it was due to laws that were changed by the Conservatives, not by Labour ultimately, but that's another conversation. So less migration, net migration does not help the rental market as a general rule. 90+% of migrants, when they first come to the country, they will rent a property. So that's been a big drop off. A lot of that has been student due to changes in the student visa requirements. But again, that's not something Labour can take credit or avoid taking the blame for. They didn't do any of that. That was through on the previous Conservative Party majority anyway. So I think Rachel will be remembered as Rachel from accounts, rightly or wrongly, for all time, puffing up her CV and all the rest of it. But also someone who probably didn't show the necessary steel that was needed to really reform the things that were needed to be reformed. She did a bit of tweaking within the brief she was given, but that's what Starmer was. He's a fiddler, he's a technocrat. He just tweaked a few things and hoped that things would happen. And the big stuff he decided to take on, winter fuel payments would be a great example. Terrible optics, hardly would have saved any money. 400 million a year, obviously ridiculous money to anyone listening to this call, but nothing in the drop in the bucket that is government spending of 1.05 trillion a year. Terrible decision making. So poor decision making, poor comms, not done enough on the property front, nowhere near enough to get to the 300,000 homes a year target. That why the government insists on saying they will build 1.5 million homes when we all know it's the likes of you and me that would build them if anyone's going to do it. I don't know. But that's what they said, and they have not anywhere near delivered on that front, on social housing, on affordable housing, on the total number of homes being built. They have just announced these reforms of the house buying and selling process. But again, will that be in Keir Starmer's legacy? I don't think so, Chris, to be honest. So pretty disappointing, pretty damp squib, generally speaking, I think, and a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I got quite excited on Friday. I think we all kind of heart of hearts knew he was going to go at some point. It was just a question of when. And you know, the ball had already started rolling post Mandelson, so it was just a case of what was going to be the next thing that was going to tip him over the edge. And it just so happened that Burnham was such a strategist in the background, and it was like a dog were bone. He wasn't going to give up on trying to get his seat. The Friday that's just gone, I got quite excited because for people that don't know, my background's a estate agency. I was a estate agent for a number of years, and when I started estate agency, I was on 11 grand a year, and that was until after your first 3 months when your exchanges and completions come in and you get your sort of commission rolling in. So generally, I'm very aware that estate agency is very low paid, very low barrier to entry, and very lack of training. And there was a press release that was done to the Telegraph and to the Independent on Friday that they were bringing in mandatory qualifications for estate agents, which massively the industry, Property Mark, the NEA have been calling out for it for many, many years, and it just sounded like it was gonna come into play, as well as a massive amount of funding for prop tech businesses that were going to help improve the transaction and the buying process for so many buyers around the country, which sounded fantastic. But then obviously Burnham got sworn in on Monday, and Keir Starmer resigned the same morning. So, in terms of your sort of prediction for going forward, Adam, it's normally a tactic, and we've seen it by the Tory government, that when they oust their leader, it gives them a reset, a chance to bring someone else in and claim that they're a brand new government, despite being elected on the same manifesto. I appreciate your expertise, lean heavily into the Chancellery and how that works in terms of the exchequer. Is that how you foresee this going? That the same policies, the same fiscal rules will be applied, or do you see a breath of fresh air coming into 10 and 11 Downing Street?
Such a good question, because I think I'm genuinely 50-50 about whether they will call an election or not. So here are the facts as they are out there. Before that by-election, Burnham was the only political figure in the UK who polled better numbers than Nigel Farage, right? Now, Farage has a certain issue, and his issue is you love him or you hate him to an extent, the Marmite section of Nigel Farage. And what we've seen over the last couple of by-elections in England is that the people are willing to organise against Farage, and it's almost like not Farage at all costs, which reminds me a little bit of Jeremy Corbyn to an extent, and a little bit of the last election and not the Tories at all costs sort of thing. And Sunak took the bullet for all of the Tory party. So there's that side of things. I think Burnham would probably be being told, if we call an election, 60% likely we'll win it. Now, would he have the support of his 170 odd majority MPs, well, all of them, the 400 odd of them, right? Probably not, because they would know they're not going to win as big a majority. Again, they could win a really small majority, but I'd say 60% likely they would win it. That's roughly where I'd be at. So no certainty whatsoever. There's obviously a strong chance of a hung parliament in this day and age, but they would catch the Green Party on the hop. They would catch Restore Britain on the hop. Kemi's not ready to release policy yet, so the Conservatives wouldn't be that pleased about it. Reform would probably be the best prepared, and Farage has been going around for a year at least saying there'll be a debt crisis. This is one of his favoured economic sound bites from a chap called Liam Halligan, who's probably the most right-wing economist who is out there in the broader media or alternative media. He's convinced there'll be a debt crisis because bond markets will spiral out of control. Liz Truss, blah, blah, blah. Now, I don't think the reform side have the remotest understanding outside of maybe 2 or 3 people of what really happened when Liz Truss was in charge. And they prove that by talking about what they think. They say things like the bond yields are worse today than they were when Liz Truss was in charge. That's not the point. The point is, when Liz Truss was in charge, the gilt yields went from about 1.5% to about 4% in a very, 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 very short space of time, a few days, right? That is earthquake volatility in the bond markets. The fact the yields are a bit higher at the moment is not really overly relevant. It's volatility that's much more important than pricing as a rule, right? So I think will they do it or not? I genuinely am on the fence about that, mate. Will they call the election? I think the way that translates through to what you said about the manifesto is if they did call the election, they would be entitled to put together their own new manifesto, a Manchesterism manifesto, a Burnhamonics, or whatever they might want to call it, manifesto. Otherwise, it's very difficult for him to come in and not try and deliver the manifesto that was set out in the 2024 election. But apart from the badly misguided ideological things that they've already done and got wrong anyway, the 2024 manifesto is not that bad, really. So if he did try and imagine if he did actually try to deliver, they said growth, growth, growth. They said they were going to cut regulation. This is in the manifesto. Now, that doesn't sound massively Andy Burnham from what we've heard and seen, but I'm not so sure about that. I think a lot of these people flex according to wherever they are at the time. I mean, look, Wes Streeting, when he was just elected when he'd just been appointed as health minister, I heard him on a radio interview saying they were asking about what he'd say to someone if they hadn't worked for 2 years and benefits and blah, blah, blah. And he said, I'd probably say to them, get a job. And I thought that doesn't sound much like a Labour politician to me, or it certainly sounds like a very central Labour politician, because I think a lot of us would say the same thing in answer to that, right? So Streeting, let's bear in mind, 7 days ago was like, we can't allow a coronation of Burnham. We've got to make sure there's a proper contest. I will be standing in that leadership contest. Fast forward to today, he's not standing. He's happily supporting Andy Burnham. What does that mean in plain English? Given that he's already been the health secretary, one of the big offices of state has been promised to him. So is Wes Streeting going to be Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, or Chancellor? My money would be on Chancellor as a general rule, I think. So he's now the front runner by some way, which will be good news for all of us who are a bit worried about Miliband, who's heard him described as a net zero zealot earlier on today, and I thought that's a pretty good description of Ed Miliband. It's a shame because a better net zero agenda could grow the country and suit the country. But again, ideology gets in the way. There'll be an argument for some level of continuity. One of the most damaging things over the last 6 years has been this continual chopping and changing. And the media's focused on that being at prime ministerial level. But it's not just that. It's in all the ministries. I mean, we know we've had, what were we on, 19 housing ministers in 16 years or something crackers like that. It's no coincidence that the housing market and the whole situation has not been solved, Chris, when you've got that sort of level of change. When you look back to the coalition government of 2010 and what they did manage to achieve with a sort of split mandate from the people, if you will, they kept ministers in post for time and things did get done. Imagine, the ministerial brief is huge. Even if you're a very smart person with a lot of mental capacity, you're going to take 3 months to get your head around it, maybe 6 months to get your head around it, right? If you're then out the door, not letting the door hit your backside on the way out within another 6 to 12 months, of course you haven't achieved anything. You've hardly had a chance to put any kind of plan into place. So if we're right, and the other names that are in the frame for Chancellor, there's a few of them, Pat McFadden, that would calm the bond markets down, but I think they'll be fine with streeting, to be honest. Darren Jones, he's talking about standing. A lesser politician, former Chief Secretary of the Treasury, maybe just to have his time in the sun. Streeting is the one who is got his trajectory sorted for PM as and when the opportunity comes up, right? This is how you do it. You move the chess pieces across the board. Now, what does that mean? Well, Burnham is known to be a proponent of land value tax. This is probably the one that will worry a few people on the call. It'd be a few quid for us, Chris, if there was a land value tax of 0.5% of the value of the property. But we've paid quite a lot of stamp duty over the past, well, certainly over the past 15 years, but over the past 5 years, particularly 5, 6 years, we've paid an awful lot of stamp duty. I would probably put it to you that if the tax was going to be 0.5% a year, which is kind of where it's mooted at, then that tax would be levied after 10 years after you've paid a 5% stamp duty bill, or 6 years after you've paid a 3% stamp duty bill. I would certainly hope so, just in the name of fairness, right? They'll probably still let you pay stamp duty or elect to pay the yearly, I'd imagine. I don't know. Maybe not. But it would help people move. And as you know, you're an estate agent who was drastically underpaid, as you said earlier on, right?
Yeah.
We charge 1%, or sometimes the industry charges 0.75% or less as a fee for selling a property.
Yeah.
If you took the stamp duty away, you create liquidity, you let people move, you then let people buy kitchens, do carpets, do this, that, and the other that they do when they move house, decorate, blah, blah, blah. That generates economic growth, VAT, and all the rest of it, right? So there would be a little shot in the arm there. And these, they're not calling them home information packs, that's what we called them in 2006, but the home report style system that it looks like we're importing from Scotland, not before time, because it's a good system, and it helps. About half the number of transactions that fall apart in England fall apart in Scotland. It's about half the number. Now, they don't have leasehold either, so leasehold creates another problem with all of that. But still, there's definitely less likelihood of falling through. And actually, if you're not familiar with the Scottish system and you're worried that, oh, well, if there's a home report, then no one will sell it below the home report value, absolute nonsense. It's the same as it always was. Everybody gets told they're going to take, this house will sell for what someone will pay for it, right? That's the value of the house at the end of the day, not what the piece of paper says. The home report quells the fears over surveys, right? The survey's already done for you. It's going to score things out of 3. What needs doing? I think that'll be helpful. Whether that will be seen as Starmer's legacy, I doubt it, Chris, to be honest. But broadly speaking, we need to look at what the cost of debt will be, because that's what matters to the government going forward, and that's what matters to us as investors going forward. And at the moment, the bond markets have been fairly calm on the back of all of this. And then oil has taken another nice tanking today in terms of its price, which will calm down the inflationary fears. In fact, I'm having more messages from people saying deflation's coming now. And it's a bit like, mate, just check your YouTube for 5 minutes. OK, we've got to deal with this now transitory wave of inflation, which will be about 12 months long. Then we'll have another 4% rise in the minimum wage. Then prices will have to go up again. So the little wagey, pricey spiral mini thing that's going on has got another year to play out yet. And then we'll see where we are as we work that through. So inflation, but inflation at 3-ish%, 3 to 4% is bearable. Unemployment, they still seem to be, they're going to need to generate some jobs and create some jobs, especially for young people. I think what we need is a national insurance break for employers' national insurance break for employing people under 25, certainly for the first 2 years or something like that. After 2 years, the employers probably won't want to get rid of them, right? I think we need something like that. Let's see what happens. But that would stimulate economic growth, lower the welfare benefits bill, increase the tax take, all good things, because apart from anything else, it's far more damaging when someone's out of work when they're young than it is when they're older, as a general rule, because the younger you are, the more out of work you are, the less likely you are to get a job at all in your life.
Yeah, I heard Jimmy Carr on a comedy podcast, and he's gone quite sincere recently and quite sort of metaverse, giving out life advice to people. And the really interesting thing he came up with, and I quite like this, is that unfortunately governments are not very good at thinking outside the box, and they're not coming up with pioneering solutions to their problems. One of the most interesting ways that I heard was actually just removing tax for anyone below the age of 30, any income tax, just remove it completely. And then when they get to 30, they should have been in a position where they could have bought their own home and put that money aside to buy their own home and actually get themselves on the property ladder and sorted within the time that they need to. Then after they get past the age of 30, they then start contributing once they've got their life together.
Well, income tax bill's about 300 and or take, I think is about 360 billion pounds a year from income related taxes. Let's say only 10% of that is paid by people under 30. Seems unlikely to me, Chris, to be honest with you. But let's say 10%, so that would make it 36 billion a year. Where are you going to get it from? I mean, I like Jimmy and he's an intelligent man. He's not a tax advisor, so definitely don't follow his tax advice. But I think these sort of broad brush policies need qualification. Now, if you were to remove the employer's national insurance contribution from it, that would be a drastically lower cost of 15% than the 28% basic, and then the 42% higher, and then the 47% higher additional, and the 60% horrible bracket around 100 grand. My policy's a lot less costly, and I'm only doing it up to 25. But you can tell I'm quite mean, and I'm an economist ultimately. So I think the cost of what I'm proposing would be sort of sub 10 billion, which is workable, findable, makeable from other sources. And you could argue is going to make some savings on the benefits side of things. Cutting people out. I mean, I feel for people who are younger. I definitely do, because I think things do get harder year on year. I'm 47. I was 48 this year, and I had a grant to go to university, a partial grant. I had no fees to pay. I was very fortunate to go to the best university in the world on the back of not paying fees. I mean, incredible opportunities. And I bought my first house when I was 23 with a self-cert mortgage and a 10 grand graduate loan. And I was getting paid £4.14 an hour at the time as a bar person / assistant manager. So those opportunities aren't there for anybody anymore. And people mistakenly say that's about the price of houses. It's not at all, because in real terms, the price of houses is back where it was in the first quarter of 2003, right? I think I bought that house in, 23, so it's 2001, maybe early 2002 when I bought that house. So we're nearly back to, in real terms today, in that £4.14 an hour job, today I'd be getting paid £13.50. So quite a lot of inflation, right? But I wouldn't be able to get that mortgage, and I wouldn't be able to borrow that loan for the deposit, right? And that's obviously, that was jolly good for me in 2001, and the world blew up in 2008 because they did that to too many people, and they were too slack on all that sort of stuff. So you've got to bear that sort of thing in mind. But I think you shouldn't go too far with these things, really. I think you need to nudge. Government should be relatively small but have decent teeth. It should nudge. There's a great podcast. People keep going on these days about things like Doge, Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, which, depending on which partisan source you read, either worked really well or didn't work at all. Very difficult to establish the actual facts in these cases, unfortunately. We already did that. We had that in 2010, right? And there's a guy who's been on a podcast recently. His name escapes me, but he was on the Rest Is Money podcast with Robert Peston and Steph McGovern. and he was instrumental in cutting about 95,000 jobs out of the civil service. They saved £50 billion between 2010 and 2015 in the civil service, right? Including a £20 billion a year ongoing cost saving. That was taking the number of staff in the civil service down from about high 400,000s to high 300,000s. It's now up to about 650,000. COVID has totally bloated it. That exercise needs rerunning with his new replacement. And this wasn't they didn't take an axe to things. They did that organic wastage thing, that horrible phrase that HR used when people leave, they don't replace them. There was a bit more performance management than there is, but I'm disgusted to say I heard a stat the other day that said you're 1/600th as likely to lose your job in the civil service as you are in the private sector. So it's 600 times easier to get fired in the private sector or lose your job than it is in the civil service. That's got to be wrong. And I don't think in this country we're too illiberal in terms of workers' rights protections. Personally, we're nothing like America where they get treated very badly indeed. So something's got to be wrong there, hasn't it, ultimately? And that sort of thing needs taken by the scruff of the neck. But that is not, I don't think, what you would see from Burnham Streeting pact in order to take the country to where it should be. But I could be wrong.
Well, you talked about continuity and sort of people coming in for the Chancellery. One of the people, and probably alluded to it with, what happened on Friday, one of the people that I've been sort of quietly optimistic about is Steve Reed as housing minister. He seems to be bringing new, fresh stuff to the forefront. And despite the 1.5 million new homes, which I think may not have come from him, would have come from maybe Rachel.
He's towing the party line, isn't he, Chris? He's got to toe the party. It's a team game.
But I wonder whether you thought maybe keeping that continuity going, someone like Steve Reed would stay in position.
Yeah, I don't think that would be too problematic in terms of where he's at on housing delivery. It will be really interesting to see how many can hold their ministerial posts. How many favours does Andy Burnham owe to whom is the question, Chris, to an extent.
Yeah.
And who does he really want to get rid of? Who's a Starmer loyalist? Well, none of them, by the looks of it, to be honest. So he hasn't got to sort of clear out the dead wood because they've come for him en masse, realistically, haven't they? Lucy Powell is an interesting one. But the trouble is, housing minister, when's the last time they appointed someone who knew a lot about housing? We did have someone, didn't we, some time back, who was a property developer, and he lasted about 6 months or less. But this is the thing, some people, when Boris was wobbling, who was it? Was it Nadim Zahawi was Chancellor for about 19 days or something, was he? I mean, some of these things have been a bit of a joke over the last few years. So I personally would not mind seeing that continuity. They need to drop the 1.5 million homes lie, but they're not going to, because they're still holding out hope that in the last year of the election campaign, 300,000 homes will be built that year. And they can say 300,000 times 5 is 1.5 million. So we did it, really. It just took us a bit longer than expected. Sorry. Not that they'll get to a run rate of 300K, Chris, the way things are at the moment, but they're going to have to start. And they have started. Sadiq Khan has loosened some of the affordable housing requirements in London, but that's because he's a man delivering 6% of his housing target in London. That's 6, folks. So 94% off. I mean, that's a mess, isn't it? It's a real mess.
Look, I don't know why they scrapped the housing delivery test in terms of the annual report that came out every January, February time, which actually held some of these local authorities to account. But
Conservatives did that, didn't they?
Yeah. Yeah, but they only ran it for 2 or 3 years and then scrapped it, which actually a lot the developers that I was dealing with at the time when this was being released were messaging me asking me when it was going to come out, when could they get the figures, and then there was a race between platforms like Land Tech, Land Insight, Searchland, and Nimbus Maps to get the housing delivery test aggregated onto the map so these developers could see which local authorities, because it was the clear, without seeing the local plan, because obviously they're only every 5 years, it was the clearest day evidence that they had of who was actually going to be more lenient on their planning applications based on how much they needed to hit those targets. And then they scrapped it. And, it's like now everyone feels like they're a bit in the dark based on who's actually pulling their weight and who isn't.
Yeah, it's a mess, and I don't think I've ever heard Michael Gove held to account for that, and I don't think I've ever heard a decent answer from him about it. I think that again, you knew that planning was going to be liberalised when Labour won the election. Previous Labour governments are the ones who've got form for loosening planning. Previous Tory governments are the ones who've got form for tightening things up on a planning perspective. But, published a piece the other day, Chris, that said in 2010, which bear in mind the back end of the last Labour government, it took 107 days to get something through planning. On average, a site, it now takes 384 days or something like that. So, or 347 days, I can't remember, but it was more than 3 times as many. So that is the Conservative government legacy. It's nothing to do with the Labour government. And that's deliberate because they don't like people building stuff, and they don't really see the interests of the younger generations as that important. They just sort of say, get on with it. And that's the way they are ideologically. They've been very anti-building, although they created opportunities with things like permitted development and stuff like that. But a lot of the Conservative administration had nearly zero interest rates. So it still made it viable. It still made it much, much easier to borrow money to build and develop, right? Or to build a portfolio. So I was very lucky in terms of the times I was very, very active before the Liz Truss debacle in terms of building a portfolio. I think I had about 550 units in 2022. So I haven't kicked on that far from there in a net. I've probably still bought about 300 since then and sold about 150 of them, right?
Mm.
Something like that. So that is a change in the business model. Bit of a sidetrack here, but that reflects what it has to look like when the interest rate is higher. You can't hold as much as you could before. You need to make a profit by selling some off in order to pay the debt down, keep the lights on, pay the staff, etc., etc.
Adam, I'm going to finish up on sort of a double barrel question, and it's really interesting to get your insight, particularly as the amount of houses that you've bought over the last few years. But before we do, please give out a shout out to anything that you're working on at the moment, or if anyone wants to reach out to you, how they can connect with you. And yeah, please let us know where people can find you.
Thanks, Chris. So best way to connect with me is via LinkedIn, Adam Lawrence on LinkedIn. So please do that. I've got 2 newsletters on there. One that's AI powered. Today it did some massive research for me on what 10 years of Brexit has done to the housing market, what's been the impact been from the point of view of our sector. And then I have my Sunday supplement, which is, I'd love to say legendary, Chris, but it's got about 4,100 followers. So if there's another 10 after this call, I'd love that to happen. And I have my YouTube channel, Proponomics. So that's all free stuff, all good ways to stay in contact with me. And then in terms of paid stuff, I have our property business workshops that I run with my business partner, Rod Turner. We've got one next week in London on due diligence. So if anyone can make that, you can Google Property Business Workshop 11 if you like, or I'll send the link over to Chris after this call that he can send out to everybody. And I'll also send out a little discount code as well as a little reward for tuning in tonight. So thank you. And then Rod and I run our boardroom club, which is for investors, developers who are serious about taking the next step up, being serious about scaling, who want to do it quickly but safely. And everybody knows those 2 things work in conflict sometimes. So we work with existing property businesses to help them go to the next level, Chris, apart from anything else.
Amazing.
So thank you for that.
And I can give you a personal recommendation on the due diligence side of things, because I often phone you and ask you to help me out when I'm trying to suss someone out. There's not a person in the industry Adam doesn't know, and is very good at doing due diligence. So if there's any sort of red flags that fly up, I always phone Adam straight away, and he's been able to help me avoid kissing a few frogs, shall we say. So yeah, please do go to his London event, because I'm sure you'll learn a lot. So here's my final question, Adam. It's twofold. With the amount of properties that you've bought, have you bought many in the Northwest? And the reason I ask that is that Andy Burnham has been synonymous with the regeneration of Manchester, and he's built relationships quite controversially with businesses like Renica. He's also on the BTR side of things, and he's also sort of ran in parallel to the fruition, if you like, of Capital and Centrica and Tim Heatley when they did that BBC Three documentary together. And the pair of them have seemed to be sort of closely tied in terms of that public image of the redevelopment of Ancoats and all that sort of stuff. So the reason I'm asking you is, if you've got properties in the Northwest, is could you give us some insight in terms of what it's like for people in the private rented sector under sort of Andy Burnham's stewardship, his King of the North, Greater Manchester mayoralty, and whether there's any sort of predictions or lessons that can be learned from the way that he interacts with the property industry that could be taken to 10 Downing Street.
Well, let me answer the second part of that first, because I think that is so crucial, Chris, really. Burnham delivered in the way that any politician of any party delivers, right? He effectively worked without ideology, apart from believing in Manchester, cross-sector, right? Cross-party, yeah? So that's how you get things done. Now, if he can take that attitude towards 10 Downing Street, and I think probably you get not a free pass when you're a mayor, but you've got nowhere near the amount of scrutiny on you, right? They started on Starmer before he was in, and they just carried on. And because he's a weak communicator, they could run the narrative. Burnham's not a weak communicator. Can he run the narrative in the same way that a Farage would be able to do, because he's such a strong communicator? Well, it remains to be seen. Will Burnham flower or will he crumble under pressure? But he's got much more ability to steer a conversation and have a results-oriented, which is, I think, what we would all want, Chris, ultimately. Putting any political differences aside, let's have a results-oriented conversation, and let's work with the necessary people that we need to, whether that's in single-family housing, whether that's in the build-to-rent sector, whether that's in temporary accommodation, whether that's in all of these potential places. If you need to tell the local authorities what to do it, but provide them with the framework and the funding in order to deliver what you're asking them to do. And by all means, put pressure on them with housing targets and allocations, as we were just talking about earlier on. So I hope he does take that forward. And I would see all of that as a really good sign, the stuff that you listed there. I hope so. But then Boris Johnson was an okay mayor of London, wasn't he? And look what happened then. Do you know what I mean? So let's not get too excited. But in terms of the Northwest as a general rule, the answer to your first question is yes, as in about 24 deals. I'm disappointed with how low deal volume has been up there over the years. Some of that is luck. Some of that is poor quality connections, not delivering enough products compared to my connections in the Midlands, who've been amazing. It depends if you count Stoke, right? As very greater Manchester, because I'm quite around Stoke. We count Stoke, it's been at least 100 units, right? But in seriousness, I was never, one of my problems with getting stuck in there was you could see the capital growth was there and you could see it was very promising, but you couldn't do the deals like you could do elsewhere. So do you want to do a deal in Manchester at 10 or 15% below, expecting good cap growth? Or do you want to deal in Swansea at 30% below, where you think it'll be steady and there's a half a chance they do a big infrastructure scheme like a tidal barrage or something like that, which might be a real jackpot play? Personally, I go for the 30% below, get the money out and go again, rather than speculating on the hotter market, if you like. But it's definitely dragged property forward, prices forward. Rents, some of the Northwest rents are quite strong these days. My personal preference at the moment is the Northeast, though, in terms of the northern regions, primarily because of those big infrastructure projects, including Tees Valley. There's some very strong rents. The rent at the collar end of the market, the lower end, is really solid, I think. And so I am actively buying up in the Northeast more than the Northwest at the moment. Some of that also comes down to, at the end of the day, when your mortgage interest rates are 6%, Chris, you haven't got a lot of wiggle room. So you can't be buying stuff in London that yields 6 if your debt is going to be 6, if you want to stay solvent, ultimately, if you're using mortgages. If you're so rich you're using cash and all that, more power to you. Well done. But I think this game still works well with leverage. If you're holding assets in cash, I'd argue you'd probably be better off buying government bonds at the moment. Honestly, it really is that much of a difference. Depends on your capital gains tax bill, depends on lots of things as always, right? So yeah, I hope he can bring some of that, whether we're going to call it Manchesterism. I hope not, to an extent. I still am not clear on why any government dropped the phrase levelling up, and we don't seem to have a replacement phrase for it. But I would expect to see some significant allocations up towards the red wall seats up there. Some of that being strategic. But then in politics, they often punish the opposition council. So will Lincolnshire be punished for having a reform council? Don't know. Difficult one, possibly. But like I say, a lot depends on whether there'll be an election either within the next 3 months or within the next 12 months. Farage is convinced we're having this election within 12 month, but I don't agree with the underlying premise and the underlying narrative. It's economically broadly illiterate, I think, apart from anything else. And it also lets Liz Truss off the hook, which I don't like doing, Chris, because she bears a lot of the blame for a lot of the stuff that went wrong in 2023, in my opinion. Although she didn't invade Ukraine, to be fair to her, to be fair. So we probably covered everything and a few more things around about with that question. I don't know if we've got time for any Q&A, Chris. If anybody's got any questions from the chat, we could have a go.
How are you doing on your battery?
8%, so they better be fairly quick, but it's holding out okay, mate.
Yeah, guys, if you've got any questions, put them in the chat, and yeah, we'll get round to them as ASAP. We'll fire them at Adam as quickly as possible. So if you do have any questions, do please put them in.
Chris, Adam, thanks for the brilliant questions. You've steered that really, really beautifully, and you got some good knowledge in there in terms of what the relevant stuff that's going on in the sector. So I'm sure everyone benefits from that when they're interacting with any of the stuff that you provide, your content, your shows, all the rest of it. So nice one, mate.
Thank you, mate. And God help you if something else happens seismic politically, because I'll be chewing your ear off not before long again. Because I love our conversations, because I think people can get quite tribal about it. And the whole landscape of politics has never been that about for me. I think there's a common acceptance with certain people that no one's coming to save you, just crack on with it. But not everyone's out to try and do you over. And that's what I get from our conversations, is you actually go, well, they did this well, but on balance, they really didn't sort this out. And I think that's what's being lost at the moment with sort of people's media channels.
Strongly agree with that. And yeah, don't get in your echo chambers, folks. Yeah, I listen quite regularly to a very left-wing podcast called Novara Media. It upsets me quite a lot, to be honest, but a little bit of cortisol isn't bad for you. But you've got to do these things to push yourself, in terms of, and understand what other people are thinking. It's fascinating.
But there was Ash Sarkar, I think, who was
the good lefty there, good solid lefty, yeah.
Yeah, and who's the chap that set it
You're
up?
thinking of Aaron Bastani, aren't you? That's the
one. Because interestingly enough, in the last, I'd say 18 months, 2 years, they have moved away from that very sort of prominent luxury communist, as they would self-diagnose it. And they've come a little bit more the other side of socialist with it, which is quite interesting seeing that happen.
Agreed. So Chris also listens to Novara Media, folks. You heard it here first. That's very,
I don't actually. I don't.
How do you know that then? How do you know that? Because that's a pretty good description, that is,
So I can't not admit to this. I'm also part of the problem, because I see the clips and I make judgments on social media based off a 30-second clip. But I do listen to a lot of podcasts, and I've watched Aaron Bastani on quite a few podcasts, and I thought, oh, I'll have a listen to this. But the one thing that struck me is how normal he came across and how articulate his opinions were, despite some of the shock jock stuff he puts out into the media.
Well, mate, his million subscriber YouTube, as it is now, roughly, or whatever, which will be getting some nice sponsorship revenue in. You're squaring the champagne socialist. All animals were created equal, but some were more equal than others, Chris. That's all you need to remember. George Orwell told us most of what we need to know 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Yeah. Well, if that doesn't make you feel inspired, I don't know what will. But Adam, thank you so much for tonight. You have pulled yourself away from a very important event. I know the organisers, and it's a fantastic event that you're at, and you've given us your time for over an hour now. And I can't tell you how grateful I am. So thank you very, very much. I applaud all our audience to go and reach out to Adam where you can, listen to his podcast, read the Sunday supplement, and most importantly, if you're interested in due diligence and protecting your own business, make sure you get down to London. And you can keep up to date with these webinars and the events we've got coming up in the UK Homes Network app. So please do make sure you download that, and we'll have a guest again next week. Adam, thanks very much. Have a great evening, and I'll let you get back to it.
Thanks, everyone. Peace out.
Take care. Bye bye.